we talked about the Trinity, and we saw how God is three persons in one God. And we saw also that when we say person, we're not using person in the modern sense, where it's another way of saying a being, three beings in one God. Of course, that makes no sense. But a person is in fact an identity. And so God is a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The issue of person answers the question, who? Who is God? God is these three people. God is the Father, God is the Son, God is the Holy Spirit. In the same way that I am several different who's. I am Brian the Father now, Brian the Son, and Brian the Spouse. Three persons in one Brian. Now this doesn't make me three different beings. I am one being, but it means that in me I have these different identities. And these identities encompass all of me. They're not like 1/3 of me is a father, and 1/3 of me is a son, and 1/3 of me is a spouse. In fact, I am all of these things together. Similarly, God is all three persons together. He is 100% the Father, He is 100% the Son, and He is 100% the Holy Spirit. So we looked at the issue of person. That answers the question, who? Tonight, we're going to look at God's nature, or specifically Jesus Christ's nature. And nature, unlike person, answers the question, what? What is God? What is God's nature? What is it that makes up God? Well, God is divine. That is the nature that God has. I am human. What's my nature? You know, the question of what is Brian? Well, Brian is a human being. Who is Brian? Well, Father, Son, and Spouse. So when we look at the nature of Jesus, we're looking at what is Jesus. And Christians confess that Jesus, unlike human beings, we all have one nature, we are all individually human. Jesus actually had two natures. Jesus was entirely God, but Jesus was also entirely a human. Was both of these two things together. And this is very important. You see, we have this rift that goes back to the beginning. This goes back to some things that we talked about a month and a half ago, when we talked about that original rift in the Garden of Eden. The garden need not be taken literally, but there was this original rift between God and humanity. And when you have these two dramatically, completely, utterly different kinds of beings, then you don't have communication. You can't bridge that communication gap. You have God on one side. God is all-knowing, perfect, immortal. God is outside of time. And then on the other side, you have humanity. Humanity is limited. Humanity is physical. We are mortal. We ride the timeline. You know, we are in time. So we have these two diametrically opposed beings. So how is it that we can communicate? Imagine it's like trying to have a conversation with a snail. Well, you're not going to get very far, right? You're going to be talking with a snail. The snail's just going to continue doing whatever it is that they do. And there will be no communication because these two beings are so completely different. You from a snail. Now that's a small difference compared to the difference between us and God. I mean, at least humans and snails are finite. We're mortal. We're on the timeline. The only difference is, of course, a intellectual capacity, and then, of course, there's some spiritual differences as well. But that's nothing compared to the difference between humanity and God, this all-powerful, glorious God. And so, if there is to be communication between these two things, there needs to be a mediator. There needs to be something in the middle, someone in the middle. And that's Jesus. And that is why Jesus had to be both God and human. Because only the God-man can bridge that gap between God and man. See? So this is why this is so vital in Christianity. That this is why this is such a fundamental doctrine in the Christian faith. Because without Jesus, without the two natures, the divine and the human nature of Jesus, we can't have any connection. We can't bridge that rift that was caused. We can't have communication between God and man. So, when we talk about Christ's two natures, his human nature and his divine nature, I'm actually going to spend most of the time tonight talking about Jesus' divine nature, that Jesus was God. Because even the critics of Christianity acknowledge that Jesus was a man. they just say he was exclusively a man, right? He was entirely a human being. But there are very few who would deny that Jesus was a human being and would just say he's just completely God and not at all human. So I'm actually going to focus my time tonight talking about why we believe that God, or that Jesus rather, was God. One of the things that irks me, one of my pet peeves, and I have many, but one of them as regards our faith, Catholicism, is the belief, the false belief, that Catholics think that Jesus was God just out of blind faith. I heard this, I taught, when I was out of college, or just out of college, I taught for a year at a Catholic high school, and I taught religion. And this is one of the things I encountered in my students, the very, very intelligent students. I taught at Bishop McNamara High School outside of Washington, D.C. Very good students, good school, but they all had this idea that, well, you know, you're a Catholic, or in that school, we had a lot of non-Catholic Christians there. You're a Christian because maybe you're raised to be Christian. You know, you believe Jesus is God because, well, you've got to believe something. That was something I heard, like word for word. You have to believe something, and that's kind of nice. I mean, Jesus seems to be a nice guy. Well, this is not Catholicism. Catholicism is not a religion of blind faith. This is a religion of the body, it's a religion of the spirit, the heart, but it's also a religion of the mind. And if you leave your mind in your pocket, and you think it's just going to be a religion of your body and your heart, then you're missing a very important part of it. Because some of what is true, not all of what is true, but a fair bit of what is true about the world, we know through our minds. Our minds are created by God so that we can encounter Him, so that we can learn about Him. And so we don't want to leave our minds behind. And that comes into focus when we look at the deity of Jesus Christ. Now, we believe that Jesus was God for very, very good reasons, because that's a pretty stiff claim. If you have someone who appears to be human, this person claims to be God, there should probably be some good reasons to believe that. If you just believe it because that person said so, well, there are a lot, I mean, there are people just a couple blocks from here, you know, on the walk here, who probably think that they're God in some shape or form. So there have to be good reasons for believing that Jesus is God. And the good news is that, in fact, there are. I'm going to focus tonight on a few of them. There are many others, but my time is limited, and I don't want to take the, this isn't a college course, so I'm going to give you kind of a bird's eye view of this. But effectively, there are three reasons that we believe that Jesus was God. First, and this is all based on the notion that Jesus claimed to be God, as he does in the scriptures, and the apostles claim that Jesus was God. But we have to weigh that. We have to weigh those claims. Are they credible witnesses? Can we believe Jesus when he said he was God? Can we believe the apostles when they claimed that Jesus was God? And for that, we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at the miracles of Jesus, we're going to look at the resurrection of Jesus, and we're going to look very briefly at the fulfilled prophecies of Jesus. I said briefly on the prophecies because I'm actually going to give an entire talk on the prophecies of Jesus when we get to the Paschal mystery later on. So I'm going to give you a really brief overview of the prophecies. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about why we can believe, or why there are good reasons to believe that Jesus performed miracles, and why there are good reasons to believe that in fact Jesus died and then actually, literally, physically rose from the dead and came back and was encountered by his followers and in fact some enemies as well. So first of all, the miracles. Now, if you look at the New Testament, you know there are a lot of accounts of miracles. And whenever you read any document, whether it's an ancient document or whether it's something that's produced in the modern day, you have to judge the veracity of that document. You have to judge the truthfulness of that document. Were the authors honest? Were the authors intelligent enough to know what they were seeing? Did the authors have maybe some hidden motivation for lying or for pulling some kind of deception? These are all very fair questions to ask about the authors of the New Testament. There's nothing wrong with being critical or approaching the New Testament with a critical eye. That's just common sense. That's just intelligent reading. So there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, if you do that with an open mind, then I think that you will come to the conclusion that I think I've come to, and that of many here, that in fact the gospel accounts are actually quite truthful. We know this for several reasons. One, when you look at a document, when you're trying to weigh the truthfulness of it, you have to look at certain signs, or you have to look for certain signs, certain hints of truthfulness, or indications of truthfulness. There are also certain signs that maybe someone is trying to deceive you. When we look at the accounts of Jesus' miracles, and they all come through the descriptions of the eyewitness accounts of the apostles themselves, we see many of these signs or these indications of truthfulness. First of all, if the apostles were making up this story about Jesus, this guy who they're claiming was God, who apparently was doing all of these miracles, they're making up a story, they're putting themselves, the apostles there, at the center of this story as his followers, because Jesus wasn't around, of course, after his crucifixion when Christianity was founded. He was gone. It was just the apostles who were there. So when the apostles were out there, if they were making up this story, then there are certain things you would expect them to do. Number one, you would expect them to make themselves look good, right? They're not going to make themselves look like idiots if their intention is to make people believe that Jesus rose from the dead and that he left his apostles in charge and that his apostles can be trusted to lead and guide the church and guard the spiritual lives of all these people. So we would expect that the apostles would make themselves look good, trustworthy, able, competent to lead the church. Well, in fact, when you look at the New Testament and when you look at Acts of the Apostles, you get a very, very different view of the apostles. You get, it's almost like the Three Stooges out there in the ancient Palestine. You have Peter, who's the head of the church, the rock upon whom Jesus founds the church in Matthew 16. Peter denies Jesus in his moment of need. When Jesus is arrested and taken to the courtyard, Peter has 3 opportunities to stand up for Jesus, and he fails each time, and then he runs in shame and embarrassment and then hides. In fact, all of his apostles, except for John, abandoned him when he was arrested. And even John is described in passing as just kind of running naked through the garden. I guess he was running from the troops, left his clothes behind. That was not necessarily uncommon back then. But the apostles don't really come across very strongly when you look at the accounts of the arrest and the subsequent crucifixion. In fact, John was the only one who was there at the cross. All the other apostles were in hiding. And in fact, after Jesus was crucified, before they saw him, before he came back from the dead, it describes them as just, they're in hiding in the upper room where they celebrated their Passover meal. They don't know what to do, so Peter says, well, I'm just going to go fishing. So they go fishing. Now these are the apostles. These are the ones who are supposed to understand this is the Messiah. The Messiah has died. We're in mourning. You know, you expect they're going to be out there setting the world on fire. And what do? They don't know what to do. They go fishing. All right? So the image that you have of the apostles is very much not what you would expect if someone was making up a story to make themselves look good or to make themselves look trustworthy to lead the church. The only reason they would include all of these embarrassing details, and I just touched on too, I mean, it's hard to get through a chapter in one of the Gospels without running into some duncery that the apostles committed. All right? The only reason that they would include these different embarrassing details is simply if these things were true. And they had to report what was true, because they had that commitment to truth. So there's an indication of truthfulness. Another one, in the Gospels, if the apostles were making up this story to put one over on the citizens of the ancient Mediterranean, and they were claiming to have witnessed these different miracle events that happened in ancient Palestine at that time, they would not include details of those events that could be easily checked out by any of the critics in the area. It will come as no surprise to you that ancient Christianity had many enemies among the Romans and among the Jewish officials. There were a lot of people who were highly motivated to show that this Christian cult was in fact a lie and based on a lie. And so there were plenty of critics out there. Why then, if the apostles are making up these stories, these miracle accounts, these alleged events that happened where Jesus defied the laws of nature, why would they include details that would lead their critics right to the not only the place, but to the people who evidently witnessed these things? I'll give you one example, although again, there are many. In John chapter 11, we have the story of Lazarus. Lazarus rising from the dead. I'm not going to read through but just to sum up the story or to refresh your mind on the story, Jesus is away with his apostles in a different town, and he receives word that one of his friends, someone he knows, Lazarus, who is the brother of Martha and Mary, has fallen ill and is dying. And Jesus says, okay, let's, I understand, and he kind of stays in that town. He continues what he's doing, and he receives another, Jesus, this is serious, and Jesus stays, and then Lazarus, in fact, dies. And then Jesus goes to the town. Lazarus has been buried in the tomb. Martha and Mary meet him. They're upset. Jesus, if you had been here, you could have saved him. Jesus goes out to the tomb and says, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus comes out. And everyone is shocked, amazed, and surely some of them are horrified. Now, this is a very famous miracle account, and a pretty powerful one. You can imagine people in the ancient world reading this and thinking, oh, come on. Well, the interesting thing is that John includes a number of really key details. He just starts, chapter 11, verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So what do we know? We know the guy's name, the guy who died and was brought back from the dead, Lazarus. We know the names of his two sisters, Martha and Mary. Now, this is not like going to Chicago and finding, Martha and Mary. Right? These are small villages. And we have the name of his village, in fact, Bethany. This is a very small village. Now, this is really interesting because if he's going to make up a story, John, that is, this miracle account story, and if he's going to have the audacity to even name the village, then he's probably going to put it far away, somewhere where no one can really check it out. It's up there, it's near Shufun, and just, take a left at the lake and you'll find maybe, but I don't know if it's there anymore. He's going to kind of fudge the details. Well, what he does here is he puts this event in Bethany. Bethany is a 20-minute walk from Jerusalem. It's 2 miles away. 2 miles away from Jerusalem. Brisk walk for any of Jesus' critics. What was the headquarters for Jesus' critics? It was Jerusalem. That's where all his critics lived. So if he's putting this miracle account out there, he's giving the name of the family, the name of the guy who rose from the dead. He's saying that the villagers, all the people saw it, were amazed, including a lot of his critics who came out and were stunned. Well, you've got all the details right there. That is a ready-made story if you want to refute this miracle claim. You go out to the town, you say, you Lazarus, did you rise from the dead? Ask the people around, did you see him rise from the dead? Because these people are claiming he did. It'd be very easy to refute. The only reason that John would include all of those details in there is if he was completely confident that the story would hold up because the story was true. This is one example. There are many. Jesus in the country of the Gerasenes. That's in Mark. Where Jesus meets the head of the synagogue there in this village, a guy named Jairus. His daughter is dead. Right? He brings her back from the dead. It's very similar. You've got details that can be very easily checked out. So again, why do this if your story can be easily undercut by someone checking it out? Well, the only reason you would do it is if it's true. So there's another mark of authenticity, as we call it. Now, we also have to look at the motivations of the apostles. What would be their motivation for lying if they're making all of this up? Well, there are a couple of motivations that kind of jump to mind, and they're quite reasonable initially. First, they could be looking for fame. They could be looking to be famous, right? These people, for the most part, were fishermen. Not all, there were some others as well, tax collectors and such. But you have people who are, at the very least, not well known in society, these apostles. And they didn't hold a high station in ancient society at that time. So maybe they were looking for fame. They wanted to be famous. Well, what kind of fame did they get making these claims about Jesus? Well, they were famous, all right. That's certainly true. But they were famous in all the wrong ways for someone who wants fame. They were hunted by the Roman officials. They were hunted by the Jewish officials. And when they were caught, they were tortured to death. Well, that's all the wrong kind of fame. Now, the interesting thing is, if they were captured, tortured, and then recanted, said, you know what, it's all a lie, well, then they would have been greatly rewarded, because this is what the Romans wanted. This is what the Jewish officials at that time wanted. They wanted to refute this Christianity cult. And so if someone, one of these apostles who claimed to have seen these things, changed his mind and said, you know what, it was all a lie. We were doing it for fame. Well, that would have been great. but none of them did. We don't have a single example of any of them doing that. In fact, all of them, except for John, were eventually caught and tortured to death. None of them recanted. They all stood by their story that these things were true. No one dies for a lie. So why would they do that? Why would they give themselves up for something that they knew was untrue? Well, the only reason they would sacrifice their lives for something when they would be rewarded for recanting is if, in fact, what they were claiming was true and they couldn't betray what they knew to be true. They couldn't betray the God that they knew existed and had encountered themselves. So it can't simply be fame. What about power? Did they have power? Well, it's a lot like fame. They didn't have much power. They were forced to live underground for years and years. They were hunted up until maybe the last quarter of the first century, when I think most of them by that point were finally caught and executed. So they really had no power. I mean, it's hard to exercise power when you can't do anything publicly, when you're always in hiding, when you're always on the run, when you're always suspicious of who's going to try to betray you, who's going to try to turn you into the officials. You know, you can't have power if you're Anne Frank hiding in an attic in Nazi Germany. How much power do you have? Well, this is not dissimilar from the kinds of lives that the early apostles led. So it can't be power. Money. What about money? Would they be rewarded? Well, this is silly. We know they didn't have much money at all, of course. Again, you know, you can't make a living when you're on the run. You can't make a living if you can't be public. And so they didn't have money. They didn't have fame, power, or money. The three big motivations for perpetrating this kind of a scam. And when captured and given the opportunity to recant, and given the opportunity not only to be rewarded, but to not be tortured to death, which is a pretty, I think, a pretty strong benefit, they refused to do that, and in fact, all went to their deaths. So the apostles themselves behaved like people who were telling the truth about the things that they saw and the things that they claimed. Now, finally, what I think is, frankly, a case closer, although I think these are all quite convincing in and of themselves. When you approach the question of whether or not Jesus did miracles, I think the best evidence for it, or the most obvious evidence for it, is simply that his critics at that time, the ancient Romans and the ancient Jews who were there, actually admitted that yes, he did. He is performing miracles. The Romans thought he was some kind of a magician. They didn't know how, but they thought he was a magician. And the Jewish officials thought, yes, he's doing these miracles, but he's performing these somehow by the power of the devil. This is a great deception that he's perpetrating. So even his critics acknowledge that, yes, Jesus performed miracles. So as you see, there are very good reasons to believe that Jesus performed miracles. This man who claimed to be God, whose apostles claimed that he was God, performed miracles as one of the evidences of his divinity. But that's not the only one. There was one, possibly the greatest miracle in his life, of course, was his own resurrection. Although you wouldn't necessarily categorize that as a miracle in the same way that these other things were. Because, of course, his resurrection was more than just evidence that he was God. It was him conquering death. It was him overcoming the power of sin for all of us. So it's part of the gospel. But for our purposes tonight, we'll just look at it as a miracle. Jesus died and rose from the dead. This man who claimed to be God gave evidence that, in fact, he had power over death. Power that really only the Creator has, right? And of course, his apostles made that same claim about it. Now, when we look at the accounts of the resurrection, there are several in the scriptures. They don't tend to read like ancient myth. The ancient world is filled with mythology. If you've ever read Iliad, fantastic, or the Odyssey, fantastic, or the Aeneid, if you've ever read any of these things, there are aspects of history in these ancient books. The first two were Greek, the Aeneid is Roman, Latin. But it's also mixed in with so much myth. There's satyrs, and then there's, Zeus is doing this, and the gods are fighting, they're doing... It has a very different character from the sober kind of style of the New Testament. And this is the kind of thing that becomes more convincing, more persuasive, the more you read of the ancient documents. The more you read in mythology, the more you realize how unique the New Testament is. And there are certain instances of the New Testament, there are certain examples, and I would actually bypass the Gospels on this and go right to the letters, that I think are particularly sobering. are particularly free of elaboration or anything that you would think might be exaggeration. And I'll give you an example. 1 Corinthians. It is frequent when you hear about, say, a political scandal or some kind of whistleblower thing. Maybe there's some corruption in a government agency. There's a whistleblower. They come out to kind of reveal the truth. Often what you'll find in terms of evidence, something they'll produce, will be things like a recording, secret recording, or maybe internal emails. Things that were communicated between parties, inside parties, that were not intended for anyone else to see. Kind of the inside email. If you want to know the real scoop about an event or an organization, the most revealing thing you can look at is their internal communications. The things they say to one another when they don't think anyone else is watching. That's what 1 Corinthians is. 1 Corinthians is Paul's letter to the church in Corinth. He wrote it to address a number of issues that were coming up with the church. This was not something that was written for the public. It was not written for non-Catholics. It was written specifically for the people in that church in the city of Corinth. I'm not going to go through the whole letter by any means, but there's one section at the very end of it, in chapter 15, where Paul says this: I'll remind you, brethren, in what terms I preached to you the gospel which you received, and in which you stand, and in which you were saved. This is what Paul says: I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Jesus died for our sins in accordance with the Scripture, that he was buried and rose, that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, the Aramaic for rock, appeared to Cephas, and then the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 people at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, and to all the apostles. Last of all, he appeared to me. These are things that Paul is not simply telling the church in Corinth. These are things that he's reminding them. Remember what you already know, that Jesus did these things. He's not speaking to a non-Christian audience where he's claiming, then Jesus appeared here, and then he appeared here, then he appeared to 500 people, then he did this. No, he's talking to people in this internal communication, to people who would already know these things, who might have been among those 500 people, who certainly would have known other apostles who told them about these things. So why is he carrying on this nonsense? Why is he carrying on this lie to people who would know better? Well, the only way he's doing it is if it was true. Now notice one of the aspects there, which is, we often skip over it, and that's the one I mentioned, 500 people. Compared to 500 people. It actually says 500 brethren, that's male. In the ancient world, sadly, when they were counting the size of the crowd, they would only count the number of men. So that's actually not including the number of women and children who would have been there. So you can safely multiply that times 3. You have 1,500 people. 1,500 people who saw Jesus in an event that the church, these people here in Corinth, would know was true. They would know that this actually occurred. And he's mentioning to it as such. And not only does he mention that he appeared to the 500 people, but he says most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Now again, if he were making this up, obviously this is internal communication, so this wouldn't be the case here, but if you were making this up, you're not going to have him appear to hundreds of people, actually probably 1,500 people, and then make the fool mistake of saying, guess what, they're still alive. No. Well, if they're still alive, you have all these people, most of whom are still alive. That means you've got a lot of different people who can back up or refute this story. If you've ever played the game telephone with just like 5 people, where you say one thing to one person and you whisper it to the ear of the other, by the time you're done, at the end of, say, 5 or 10 people, that story has been completely shifted. It's hard to get 2 people to agree on anything that they witness, much less 1,500 people. So the only way, again, that he would mention that is if the event occurred, he knew it occurred, and he knew that the story would hold up to scrutiny. And in fact, the people there at the church in Corinth knew that as well. Another thing, the resurrection, the first people to see Jesus were women. Now, why does that matter? Well, the ancient world, especially the ancient Jewish community, was not known for their love of women's rights. And in fact, it was a highly patriarchal society. The word of a woman was not valid in Jewish court. It was considered to have no value at all. So if you're making up a story, and the story is going to be largely based on the truthfulness or the believability of the witnesses, you're not going to make the main witnesses people whose word has no value in Jewish court. You're going to say he appeared to men. The only reason they would say he appeared to women is if it was true. It was also extremely embarrassing, would have been very embarrassing to the apostles, because he appeared to Mary Magdalene and the women, not to the apostles. The apostles didn't even believe Mary when she told them. They had to go to the tomb and check it out. Again, another embarrassing detail, that if the apostles were making up that story, they certainly wouldn't have done that. They certainly would not have done that. So, another indication of truthfulness. Finally, when you look at the resurrection story of Jesus, when you look at the resurrection accounts of Jesus, it isn't enough to simply look at that event, the accounts that are in the scriptures, and say, well, I see that problem, and that problem, and that problem. You have to balance that story against the rival explanations for what happened. We know that Jesus' tomb was empty. Even Jesus' critics acknowledged that. The Jewish officials and the Romans said his body was stolen out of the tomb. So everyone acknowledged that Jesus was gone, or else they could have just brought out his body and said, look, here's the end of Christianity right here. So everyone acknowledges that something happened with Jesus. Jesus' tomb was empty. Jesus somehow disappeared. So we have to look at the other explanations to see if they have any reasonableness, any believability in and of themselves. If they don't, and this account, the traditional Christian account, remains kind of untouched, well, then it's most reasonable to believe this one. So what are the other claims, the other explanations for what happened to Jesus? Well, one, of course, is the conspiracy theory. This is a personal favorite. This is the idea that the apostles got together. Jesus died on the cross. This is the claim. The apostles got together and said, you know what? Let's say that Jesus was the Messiah, that he rose from the dead. And so what we need to do is steal the body out of the tomb and hide it, then we can make this claim. This is the account that is given in kind of more modern books. The Passover plot is the big one. I want to say it's Rabbi Herb Schoenen. I forget if that's his exact name. But I think that came out in the 60s. And then there have been many books after that that have basically followed the same thesis. That have kind of copied him, actually. Well, the problem with this is that it just does not fit the actual event. And it shows a profound ignorance of the region, the time period, and the culture there. When this occurred, when Jesus was executed, this was during Passover week in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the capital there of Israel. The people come into Jerusalem, Jews from all over come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. So it's packed with people. You have festivals going on, you have people all over the place, people in the streets. The city is packed to the brim. This is why Jesus and the apostles, there was some concern over whether or not they could find a room. If you recall that, finding a room to rent, because the city was packed. Everyone was there for Passover. But not only that, you also had this political tinderbox going on. Jerusalem, Israel, was under Roman occupation. And there was a very, very strong independence movement brewing there in Israel. Kind of a proto, what we would consider you could call a proto-terrorist or a proto-revolutionary movement at the time, led by some people called the Sicarii, which are the Sicarii or daggers that they used in assassinations. Barabbas was one of the Sicarii from the Gospels. So you have this group of people, these zealots, who are fighting for Jewish independence from the Romans. They're just itching to cause violence, and you've got kind of riots there. You have this simmering revolution that would later break out in the first century, around the 60s, and then culminate in 70. And so you have this simmering political situation in the midst of this religious festival. So not only is the city packed with religious pilgrims, but it's also full of Roman soldiers who are there to make sure that there is no revolution, that there is no violence, that there's no riot that breaks out, or no assassinations or crimes. So you've got the streets patrolled, you've got the places are packed, there's really nowhere to hide. And so then when you imagine that Jesus dies, is buried in a tomb right outside the city walls, an easy view of people, that somehow the apostles go in the middle of the night, They go down, they roll this enormous stone, which is several tons. If you've ever seen one of these stones that you see on these ancient tombs, somehow they're able to remove the tomb, get past the Roman centurion, the Roman guards who were there, who would be executed if the body was stolen. So they have every motivation to make sure that doesn't happen. And then somehow hide the body. It's like, whenever I think of this, it's so ridiculous. It's like an episode like Benny Hill, where they're running around the city with, they're running around the city with this body trying to hide it. Dodging troops in crowds and things like that. Like, what are you going, what's that? Where are you going with that? It's so improbable, it's so unbelievable that it defies common sense. And so the conspiracy theory of Jesus' resurrection just doesn't work, doesn't fit the facts. What about the idea that Jesus accidentally died, accidentally survived the crucifixion, and then later appeared to his followers, and then they got confused and thought that actually he'd come back from the dead? This is actually an explanation. That somehow Jesus survived the crucifixion, and while he was in the tomb, he somehow revived and woke up and and they threw the stuff off, opened the tomb somehow again, how he got this 3-ton rolling stone open, kind of wandered past the Roman guards, found where his apostles were staying, and then appeared to them, and they thought, oh my gosh, he's back from the dead. Well, again, this is silly. It's silly even just saying it. It's kind of funny. First of all, the Romans knew how to kill people. I mean, the Romans, if they had a thing, if they had a skill, it was how to execute people. The Romans had perfected crucifixion. It was the perfect form of execution for them, because it was excruciating. It lasted a long time, and it was humiliating, and it was embarrassing to be naked, sprawled out, dying in front of people. It was perfect. They really knew how to do it. And so no one was going to survive a crucifixion, just point one. Point two, even if somehow that happened, you had like a flunky, you had like a legionary trainee, right, like an intern, right, and somehow he botches the crucifixion, even though this was a major crucifixion for the Romans. They had every motivation to get it right. Somehow he botched it. Jesus managed to survive, and then wakes up inside the tomb. Well, what condition is he going to be in? Well, he's had spikes driven through his wrists, so those nerves are severed, so he can't use his hands. He's had them driven through his ankles, so his feet are broken and bleeding. He's been flogged, the skin flogged off his back. He's had the skin all around his head pierced with these horrible thorns, and then hammered in. He's been up in the Palestinian sun for hours, where he's gotten dehydrated. And then he's been thrown into a tomb covered with 40 pounds worth of spices. That's the spices, the wrap that they would give the bodies. I mean, this is packed on. This is much more than you'd see with a mummy. I mean, this is like a cocooning. He's packed with these spices. And then he's sealed in with a 3-ton stone, guarded by Roman legionaries. Well, if he somehow is able to wake up, throw off the 40 pounds that have wrapped it, get that stone to the side somehow, sneak past the Romans, and then appear to the apostles, he's not going to be very impressive. He's not going to be like, hey, here I am. He's going to be limping, he's going to be dehydrated, probably hallucinating. No one would mistake him for coming back from the dead. So the idea that it was some kind of confusion is silly. It just simply doesn't work. So what about the idea that the apostles, Jesus actually died on the cross, and then the apostles hallucinated? They loved him, they followed him for 3 years, he died this humiliating, horrible, painful death, and then out of sincere wish fulfillment, they believed that they saw him. We sometimes hear people who are grieving deeply believe that they see their relatives in the corner of a room, or they hear them, or they smell them, and they feel their presence. And that's certainly true. That happens sometimes with grief. But the accounts of the sightings, these resurrection accounts, don't look anything like those kinds of experiences. These resurrection accounts are instances where Jesus appears not just to one person, but to all of the apostles, or to heavens, 1,500 people. And Jesus has conversations with them. They eat supper on the beach at the end of the Gospel of John. They're eating fish. He's sitting with them. These are not accounts that would fit in with an idea that they are hallucinating. You can reject these accounts if you have other reasons, but you can't claim that these are hallucinations. It just doesn't work. And then finally, linked to this, what about the idea that the apostles were mentally ill and believed that these happened? Well, this you can just eliminate right up to that. If you've ever read any of the Gospels, if you've ever read the letters of Paul or Peter or John, these are things that are written by people clear of mind, who are convinced that they've seen something real. The ways that they describe these things are very sober, and they have none of the evidences of mental illness. And so, when you look at the rival claims or the rival explanations for what happened with Jesus, why his tomb was empty, they just don't hold up. The most reasonable account by far, is the account that the Christians said, that Jesus was God. He came to fulfill prophecy. He performed miracles, and he rose from the dead. The final evidence for the resurrection is my own personal favorite, because I think it's the most stirring of all, almost the most moving of all. And that is just one word, Paul. Paul, the Apostle Paul. Who was the Apostle Paul? He wasn't always named Paul. He was actually known better at that time as Saul. Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus was not one of the apostles of Jesus. In fact, Saul of Tarsus was a rabbinical student. He was the student, the number one student, the star student of the Rabbi Gamaliel, who was and continues to be the most famous rabbi in Jewish history. Gamaliel, great rabbinical scholar. And Saul of Tarsus was his star pupil. Not only was he the star pupil, but when this Christian cult began to erupt, Saul was one of these people, he wants to be on top of it. He's one of these hyper-Orthodox, killed this new religious movement types. And so he went after Christianity. He was one of the strongest persecutors of Christianity in the Jewish community. He was there when the first apostle was murdered. He held the coats of those who killed him. He was there for that. And then finally, he was on the road. He was traveling up to a city called Damascus, there in modern-day Syria. And he was going to Damascus to actually obtain bills of arrest so that he could start arresting Christians on his own. And while he was on this road, he had some kind of encounter with Jesus where he was rendered blind. We don't know exactly what happened, but it was something very profound. He met Jesus on that road, and what he experienced transformed him. And he gave up the persecution of Christians, and he became, overnight, their strongest advocate. And in doing so, he became the number one enemy for the Jewish officials at that time. He went from being their star, their head, their hammer, their hitman. He went from that to becoming their number one most hated enemy, the person they wanted to get the most, the need to get Saul of Tarsus, this betrayer, this turncoat. Now, what did he have to gain? He gave up everything. He was a star. He was the pupil of the most famous rabbi in Jewish history. He had a future that was laid out for him. He was a great scholar. He had a perfect memory. He was a great writer. All of these things. He had a great future. And yet he gave all of that up with one decision and became the single most hated person at that time in all of Judaism, in the Jewish world. Now, why would he have done that, given up everything and embraced something that he had been persecuting, unless the encounter that he had with Jesus actually occurred? It's the only reasonable explanation for why he did that. So when you look at the miracles, when you look at the resurrection, when you look at the apostles themselves, the ways that they reported these events, the ways that they were brutally honest about their own failings, and there were many, the ways that they stood by what they said, even at the expense of their own life, even when they would have been rewarded and had they given those up. When you look at the strange change of mind and heart of Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul, the Roman name, Paul the great apostle. When you look at all of those things, it becomes very easy to believe that in fact this event was true. You see that there is a real a quite compelling case to be made for Jesus' resurrection. The final aspect of this, and I said this is very brief, is that Jesus fulfilled a number of prophecies in the Old Testament about the Messiah who would come. Now, there are different ways to count the prophecies. There might be 100 or so. Some would say many more. If you're counting that high, or if you're getting a count that high, then a lot of these prophecies are fairly minor, fairly small, and to my mind, actually kind of ambiguous that they're actually prophecies. But you have a pretty good number of very compelling, powerful prophecies. For example, in Isaiah 53, the prophecy of the suffering servant who comes and who bears our sins and who dies with the wicked, just as Jesus died between the criminals and the cross, and then was buried in the tomb of a rich man. That's from Isaiah, written hundreds of years before Jesus died. Of course, Jesus was buried in the tomb of a rich member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court. So there are a number of prophecies like that. We looked at wisdom a few weeks ago, where I read that prophecy, another very clear one. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we're going to cover the prophecies in some detail when we go through the Paschal mystery. So I don't really want to spend much time here on that, because otherwise there would be a lot of overlap. So the case for Jesus' two natures, that he was human, which everyone acknowledges, and that he was divine, is actually very strong. No Christian, no Catholic should ever feel embarrassed to believe these things. Nor should we feel that somehow we have to make this leap of faith that these things are true. Because in fact, when you look at the evidence of these, you find that in fact they're quite compelling, and the counter-explanations are actually quite weak. So, questions? I covered a lot of time.